Hi folks, I'm Mike and welcome to another Mike Chat on my small YouTube channel that I'm running mostly as a benefit to Ukraine. And even though this channel isn't yet monetizable, I have a fundraising update that I'll be sharing later in this episode. We're also going to talk about some of the insane American policy decisions for the week and how Europe might be coming together to respond. And I'm going to fire a small volley at mainstream media. But first, I want to talk a little bit about how this channel is developing. Not in terms of the audience or the number of viewers, but in terms of the topics that I'm talking about and how I'm talking about them. Because I had hoped, when the channel started, not to make this channel about being anti-Republican or anti-Trump. Sure, there would be things I would disagree with, but I wanted to give the benefit of the doubt also to Trump voters. Most Republican voters were still in favor of supporting Ukraine, even if they were worried about escalation to nuclear war. Their vote for Trump wasn't a vote to get Ukraine to capitulate, but a vote for the hope that Trump's strength and ability to cow political adversaries would be a tool to bring Putin to heels more effectively than the commotion in the European Parliament or an aging Biden or Kamala Harris, who they worried was incompetent. And a hope that this could be done instead of continuing to increase Ukraine's lethality on the battlefield. When I started, I refused to believe that supporting Ukraine in principle would be turned into a partisan wedge issue. But I was wrong. And I think it's absolutely terrible that I was wrong. And so over the last few weeks, I'm afraid this channel has become increasingly distasteful to Republicans. Not that I would explicitly attack the voters. I actually gave MAGA the credit of not being like the AfD, which is explicitly pro-Putin in its entire policy platform. But I was wrong. And that wall is broken now when we see how Republican voters have been reacting to the press conference last week. How easily they let themselves be primed to see only what Trump wanted them to see, because they let them frame the conversation ahead of time, to get them to look for signs that Zelensky is a beggar who doesn't want peace and disrespects the American people. The truth is that the Trump administration and their social media and AM radio, Fox News, and YouTube apparatus has been extremely effective at casting a pro-Russian light on the entire topic to a point where they now interpret events through a lens that the rest of us couldn't even relate to. There won't be any way to reach them again for the foreseeable future. Another development is that I think I can't help but cover recent events in a sort of roundup every week. I hope I can still find time to make the occasional video with higher level analysis, like for example, explaining exactly why Putin's war really is a war against Europe and not against Ukraine, by diving more deeply into the statements and written declarations that Russia made before it invaded. But it's not possible while current events are causing the strong emotional reactions that they're currently doing. I mean, what the fuck? We now have an American president who, just in the last week, has insulted an actual wartime president who has absolutely heroically chosen to stay and defend his country when he was actually being offered to be evacuated from Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression, and who has never shown anything but respect and appreciation to the American people, and then gone on to forcibly stop the flow to weapons to Ukraine, then stopped sharing intelligence with Ukraine in the fight against Russia, and finally actually stopped allowing private companies to share satellite imagery with Ukraine. Make no mistake, Ukraine also absolutely has to make sure that they're not overly dependent on Starlink at this point. Starlink is a trap. Starlink will likely be cut off as well in the coming weeks, and it may even turn out to share Ukrainian communications with Russia. It's absolutely crucial that Ukraine and Europe continue to make the US less important to Ukraine's defense against Russia, in order to stop the conflict from spreading into other countries and really escalating into something that actually could be called World War III. And by the way, with all this talk from Trump about how Ukraine is difficult to deal with, remember one thing. Putin can still end this war simply by going home. He gets an amazing deal if he just leaves Ukraine. Think about this. Despite the fact that he has invaded another country and is responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians, as well as hundreds of thousands of his own citizens, the deal on the table for him is to simply stop. And there will be no negative consequences for Russia. If he just leaves, the entire West, Europe and the US, can easily agree to reduce sanctions on Russia. No one is threatening to forcibly remove him from power. No one is threatening to seriously attempt to extradite him or face justice at the ICC. No one is threatening to invade Russia. No one is threatening any consequences against Russia whatsoever for having invaded Ukraine. All he has to do is leave. That's it. In fact, the entire rest of the world has so far consistently forced Ukraine not to actually impose serious consequences on Russia for having invaded. That's the simple truth. Anything else is just Russian propaganda and the will of a few American billionaires who want to buy Russian assets cheaply now and then see sanctions lifted in order to increase the value of their investment, no matter what the cost to international stability or Ukraine's future. And those are the kind of Americans that the world now has to deal with. Don't kid yourselves. I never meant to make extreme statements on this channel, but it's impossible not to talk about extreme perspectives when I look at how things are developing. In this light, I'd like to encourage everyone who's watching this channel to consider donating to one of the more established NAFO fundraisers when they have the chance, and when they have a bit of spare cash available. We can't make up for the flow of weapons or intelligence, but I am sure that these kinds of donations do make a difference over time. They fund civilian equipment that can be used for important logistics, pickup trucks, and other transportation vehicles, and even more importantly, to build trenches with fundraisers that help purchase used excavators and fix them up. This money tends to be spent efficiently, $5,000 to $10,000 for a used machine that may not be working properly, and then some volunteer mechanics in Ukraine or in a nearby country to get it working. Sadly, chances are that the vehicles don't have a very long lifetime, because they might get destroyed, but that's just the reality of war, and it's still saving lives while it's working. That's why I spent a total of 800 euros across 2 fundraisers, and I'm proving it here. This goes to the NAFO 69th Sniffing Brigade, a funny name but a very real fundraiser that helps purchase pickup trucks for logistics, and also for a fundraiser highlighted by Konstantin that helps purchase excavators. For now, that's all I can afford to make available, but if it can inspire a few of you to also donate, it's worthwhile. Also, while we're at it, I would encourage anyone who's running a NAFO or other pro-Ukraine YouTube channel to look carefully at their analytics and audience profiles. I've noticed that since shortly after the Trump election, my videos have no longer been shared beyond my pre-existing subscribers. I have no idea if the same is true for other pro-Ukraine channels. I did inquire and found that there were no flags or strikes against this channel. Nothing has been deemed to violate copyright or YouTube policy. I suspect some reasons for this have nothing to do with politics, but it would be good for other channels to make sure that they're not in the same situation. In the meantime, I'd encourage you to share the videos, call them out on your own channels if you have them, and I can keep doing the same if I come across something that I think is worth sharing. Moving back to something more serious, probably Ukraine's biggest problem right now is air defense ammunition. Patriot missile systems will run out of ammunition, and this will come at a direct cost to Ukrainian civilians. Even with missiles, the Patriot systems may be connected in part to American intelligence sharing systems that are included in the list of what has been suspended by the US, making them less effective. Europe can deliver more of its own air defense systems to Ukraine, but also has to scramble to build more of them because it can't rely on any Patriot air defense batteries that are installed on its own soil. But then there's also cause for optimism. Europe is showing every sign of being serious to shore up its defenses with an additional 800 billion euros. That's about $850 billion, and step up to provide more support for Ukraine. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz intends to allocate an additional 900 billion euros for defense, infrastructure in Germany, and support for Ukraine. In addition, the European Union is preparing to actually establish the logistical foundation for collective defense, which is so far only a theoretical clause in its constitution, and looking to increase average defense spending of all European countries to about 3.5%. Now, in the spirit of what I said earlier to be fair to Republicans, I guess let's be fair. This is what Trump promised his voters. It could be that he's forcibly, crudely, but effectively creating a scenario where Europe stands up for the cost of its own defense so that the US can focus elsewhere. He may be doing this by creating enough uncertainty about what the US might do, and he may well be planning that if the EU has a large enough military, he can put more pressure on China and Russia to contain what he sees as a growing threat. The problem is that it's incredibly hard to tell, and it's not really substantiated by his actions against Ukraine. Holding Ukraine hostage and extorting it with minerals and metals deals that make no sense at all is too cruel for anyone to trust that Trump has any beneficial intentions whatsoever. If this really still is his goal, Trump could have reached it much more diplomatically. And I don't trust for 1 second that his goal is to save US taxpayers money on international defense. The whole narrative that the US would have ever spent less on defense if other NATO countries had spent more is complete bogus anyway. It's a politically convenient lie that Republicans tell their voters whenever they increase defense spending. And usually they're doing it because they're about to start unpopular involvements in other countries. And those involvements are almost never done with NATO support because it would violate the reason for NATO's existence, which is to secure peace. Now, back to Merz's spending plan, where we also have cause for a lot of optimism. This is in Germany, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about. So far, I'm a huge fan of how Merz, the incoming chancellor, is acting, and he's being as creative as he needs to be in order to do the right thing. He knows that his own parliament, which starts the last week of March, will be somewhat crippled by multiple anti-European, anti-German parties in its own ranks. The AfD and Die Linke, which would obviously coalition with each other if they had had a sufficient share of government, don't have enough seats to block regular legislation over the coming years. But they could block the spending package that Merz now needs to allocate 900 billion to Germany's defense, which he's planning to do. That package requires a 2/3 majority because it changes Germany's constitution to soften Germany's debt brake, which is like the American debt ceiling that doesn't really exist. Except the German one does. For the moment, the SPD, CDU, and Greens party have the necessary seats, and they can afford for a few politicians in their ranks to vote against the package, provided that some of the FDP politicians vote in favor as well. This looks likely to succeed, though the negotiations have so far only included the SPD and the Union, CDU and CSU, and now the Greens will look for some concessions so that they can also retain some influence over the policy in the coming years. Now here, by the way, is an example of how media can seem dishonest or incompetent. Look at this headline. It translates to, "Not like this, say the Greens. The Green Party is outraged over the result of the coalition agreement between the SPD and CDU and starts to ridicule them as the small coalition and makes strong accusations against their alliance." This is caustic bullshit. What's really happening here should be obvious, and honest media should explain what it is. The Greens are negotiating, using their public platform because they want to bring some additional topics into these agreements. That will help them show their base, and hopefully others in the electorate, that they still know how to exercise some influence, and they will use that to attract voters. They're also giving a bit of a preview of what their narrative as an opposition party would look like, since they'd have to take the role of a heckler if they're cut out of the decision-making process completely. So, a responsible media headline that doesn't make the newspaper look like it's the Green Party's bullhorn would say something like, "Greens showcase their first opposition tactics as a threat, hoping to be given more political influence as a minority partner to the next governing coalition." Maybe it doesn't sound as snappy, but I don't particularly like newspapers when they just quote politicians without explaining the circumstances in which the politicians are speaking. But what I expect to happen here is that the Greens will get some changes made to the current agreement between the other two parties so that they can show a success to their voters, and then approve the defense agreement. The Greens are actually the most aggressively in favor of defending Europe and Ukraine right now, which is probably why the other two parties haven't even been bothered asking them if they would vote for the package yet. As far as I can tell, the Greens are still negotiating in good faith, even with this public opinion tactic that they're playing here. And with that note of optimism, I'll leave you today. I hope that you found this interesting. Give it a thumbs up, comment if you think I left something out or got something wrong, and please share the video with your friends or in a post on YouTube or on your social media channel if you want to support what I'm doing to highlight and support fundraisers. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.